Thank you all for joining us to celebrate and discuss the release of our report, Economic Security for the 21st Century. I'm Renée Landers, and I'm the chair of the Academy's board and co-chair of the Economic Security Study Panel, which guided the work on this project. Of course, we are very excited to release the report because it is the result of so much thought, time, and energy on the part of a lot of people. But we are most excited because the policy options are capable of making a tremendous impact in the lives of 100 million Americans who live with incomes at less than 200% of the federal poverty measure. In the lives of the 17% of US children in poverty as a result of January of this year, and in the lives of the over 500,000 unhoused individuals in the nation. But before we dive deeper into the report process, the pillars, and the policy questions, I want to pass the baton off to my colleague, Jason Fichtner, who served as the other co-chair of the panel, for a few brief comments.
Thanks, Renée. And it was a pleasure to be a co-chair with you on this panel and for all the panelists who worked so hard on this. One thing I've always appreciated about the Academy is its commitment to bringing in voices across the policy spectrum. This report is no exception. And although this made for challenges throughout the process, the policy options report are better because of the broad range of experts that weighed in and contributed. On this note, as a part of this report, we are grateful to have engaged with members and representatives of communities that are often left out of the policymaking conversation. Input from the most effective communities is a necessary part of good policy, and we expect this to be reflected in all Academy work moving forward. Before we proceed, a few housekeeping notes for everybody. First, today's webinar is being recorded and will be accessible online. Second, we encourage you to participate in today's dialogue using the tools on your screen. There are two ways to participate. Type comments in the chat box or use the Q&A box for specific questions for the panelists. Both the boxes are available on the menu at the bottom of your screen. We also welcome questions via email after the webinar. Thanks again to everyone for being here today. I really appreciate it. And now I will pass to the Academy CEO, Bill Arnone, to discuss the report process and how we ultimately landed on the pillar framework. Bill?
Jason, thank you. And thank you, Renée. I am really thrilled that we're having this event today. As the Academy's Chief Executive Officer, I also served as the project manager for this extraordinary report. I'm pinch hitting today for Kathryn Edwards, the report's principal investigator, who is dealing with a bout of COVID at the moment. So please join me in wishing her well, along with so many others in our networks who are still experiencing the effects of COVID. Now, this study panel was convened in the fall of 2019. And when we set out on this extraordinary journey, and it has been quite a journey, we did so in the context of a concept, universal basic income, otherwise referred to as UBI, being in the limelight back then and continuing to be in the limelight, both in the United States and throughout the world, with experiments going on as we speak. The study panel set out to explore how the United States federal government might go about guaranteeing some level of income through the entire federal income security landscape. The panel sought to identify the gaps in this landscape and assess policy options to fill those gaps. Now, we set an original, admittedly ambitious timeline for this project at about 14 months. And here we are, over 2.5 years and one pandemic later. Who would have thought that taking on the entire federal income security ecosystem would have taken so long? But following its initial in-person pre-pandemic meeting, the study panel's deliberations occurred remotely via Zoom, which I might add was itself a bit of a barrier to the type of freewheeling in-person give and take that we've come to expect from Academy study panels and task forces. Despite that, though, the panel operated with an enormous amount of painstaking diligence and patience with this prolonged process. So hats off to the members of the study panel, to Kathryn Edwards as the PI, and to Griffin Murphy as the policy analyst who is responsible for all of the in-depth research to support everything in the report itself. In the first part of today's webinar, we're going to walk through our broad process in constructing the report. We think there's value in all of you having insights into how we went about this. Then some of our study panel members will outline each of the report's pillars, and then we'll be taking questions, as Jason said, from all of you. In the second part of the webinar, we'll be joined by 3 stakeholder representatives, and they'll be discussing the issues and needs of their communities and how the options in the report relate to them. So once again, use the Q&A function on Zoom so we'll have a chance to get your involvement as we have a robust discussion of the report's findings. I'd like to start with an inspirational quote that really inspired the work of the panel. And the quote comes from the report of Franklin Roosevelt's Committee on Economic Security, which I continue to view as one of the landmark documents in U.S. policy history. The committee outlined an ambitious vision for a system of economic security policies. And although almost all people in our country today are better off than most people were back in 1935, we still fall very short of this ambitious goal. And this was our starting point. And as you reflect on this quote, the study panel, as it reflected on this quote, really faced 3 definitional questions. Question number 1, when we say income, what do we really mean? Are we talking only about cash? Are we talking about non-cash resources, income tax policy credits and deductions? What goes into the concept of income? Definitional question number 2, what does adequate mean? How much is adequate for one individual living alone compared to a household with 4 children? How much is adequate for a household in New York City versus a household in rural Iowa? Is enough to afford food and shelter adequate? And even if that were, what quality of food and what quality of home are we talking about? And then definitional question number 3, lastly, what does assured mean in the context of assuring income? Must an adequate income be assured every month, every week, every day? And how does assurance relate to unassured forms of income? So these were the types of questions that the study panel focused on, as well as other questions that generated continuous debate among our study panel members. If you look at the members, I like to call many of the Academy study panels convenings of strange bedfellows, people who you might say, can they agree on anything? Well, believe it or not, this study panel was able to proceed with significant consensus in acknowledging that many of our programs do offer income in the form of cash or resources. They agreed that the federal poverty measure is not an accurate indicator of adequacy. They agreed that current means-tested programs with their burdensome applications and income and asset tests do not provide assurance. In some, current U.S. policy offers inadequate income to many, and that income is by no means assured. So let's now look at the next slide. After working through these definitional issues, we decided to use the original committee's framework for breaking into working groups. So we began breaking groups into early life, middle life, and late life, along with a finance working group. We thought at the get-go this was a useful framework for breaking down our study panel because their members did have expertise that fit pretty well into these life stage categories. And they also helped us think about periods of economic security that we all can identify with. Think about what moments and events across the lifespan when each of us have had to face the most economic insecurity. And where are the gaps in our system at each stage of life? So these initial provocative questions allowed us to outline the existing programs that attempt to boost income to households and to take a closer look at how they both succeed and fail at meeting existing needs. As a result, all of the income security policies discussed in this report involved increased spending, and we had to acknowledge that. So we had a finance working group that was focused on options to increase tax revenue to fund such increased spending. Now, while the life stage framework was instrumental in setting the groundwork for support, we ultimately decided that it did not make sense to address policy options in these life stages, as economic security in each stage of life is very closely tied together. These are not hard and fast lines. Life doesn't work that way. Higher wages and better jobs in middle life, for example, negate some of the need for government to boost incomes in late life. More resources in early life means more resources for parents at a different stage in life. So with this in mind, we move toward an approach that we believe better captures how people receive income, how people accrue wealth, what is preventing many from accruing wealth, and how opportunities to increase income and wealth are distributed across our society. The result is the pillar framework that we use in the report. And here's a rough graphic of how we are conceptualizing 4 pillars: labor, benefit, protection, and equity. Each pillar is a necessary part of a well-functioning economic security system. And we concluded that this framework and the policy options in our report will help policymakers move toward achieving the vision of an adequate assured income, quote, to each human being in childhood, in youth, in middle age, or in old age, in sickness, or in health. Now, with that introduction, we're going to move to brief presentations by members of the study panel. First, Alix Gould-Werth, who is the Director of Family Economic Security Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, will present the labor pillar. She'll be followed by Andy Stern, a Senior Fellow at the Economic Security Project, who will present the benefit pillar. I'll return and present the protection pillar. And then finally, Renée Landers, co-chair of the panel, will cover the equity pillar. So Alix, let me turn this to you, and let's start looking at our pillars. Alix?
Great, thanks so much, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here. So labor is the primary way that most households gain and sustain income. As such, the goal of labor policy is to help all people who are able to work find secure jobs that support dignified livelihoods. As you'll see on the next slide, right there on the next slide, labor policy in the report is essentially broken down into 3 different categories, which involve boosting compensation to adequate levels, improving workplace conditions to respect workers' lives beyond the workplace, and supporting workers who are seeking employment. The slide shows the broader policy options that we outline in the report. So under compensation, the report explores the well-known issue of the minimum wage, as well as the lesser-known issue of sub-minimum wages, which continue to be paid to certain workers with disabilities, tipped workers, student workers, incarcerated persons, and others. Moving to the next column, under conditions, we look at the thresholds for overtime exemption, as well as rules around worker schedules. We also look at required disclosure of prior criminal records, disclosure of prior salary and pay information, how regulatory agencies such as OSHA and the EEOC are unable to effectively enforce rules, and making it easier for workers to join a union. Lastly, under returning to work, the report outlines a job seekers allowance, transitional jobs, and better job training before discussing options to improve unemployment insurance. Now I'll pass it to Andy Stern to discuss the benefit pillar.
So when we talk about benefit policy, what we're really talking about is taxing and spending that the federal government does that results in money or resources being given to individuals, both in terms of increasing their income or increasing their resources. And I have to say, as someone who's been to too many meetings about economic security, this has been the most sophisticated and the most comprehensive effort I've seen of trying to look forward in terms of how in the 21st century do we provide economic security, and as Bill talked about, assured income as well. So if you think about benefit policy, on the spending side, there's really two different ways that we do this. One we call social assistance. These are cash benefits that are directed, generally speaking, at people in need in order to take them out of a situation where they're economically insecure. And they are, again, more targeted and more transfer policies. And the second is social insurance. And by social insurance, I mean these are programs that individuals contribute to. Because of their contributions, they earn eligibility, and then they later can claim the benefits. Think Social Security, think unemployment insurance. But these are more not targeted, but more universal kinds of programs. So that's the spending side. On the tax side, what we did is we took three different kinds of tax policies: tax credits, tax deductions, tax exemption, and we grouped them together, and we call them tax expenditures, where the government is spending money through the tax system to do things. So we have spending, the spending side, we have the tax side. And then within it, there's always a series of questions that we struggled with in almost every benefit that we talked about. First of all, who should be targeted? What's the range of income? What's the community that we're trying to address needs for? Secondly, how do we do this in a way that we encourage work and self-sufficiency? And then finally, how do we deal with the fact that everything costs money? And how do we finance it, as Bill talked about earlier? So we took the spending side, social assistance and social insurance. We took the tax side, credits, deductions, and exemptions. We wrestled with the issues of who they should go to, how do we encourage work, and how much do they cost? And then if you look at the report, you'll see two large categories of how we divided this up. One is what we called either update or reform. And these are situations where either the benefit design or the amount of the benefit we felt needed to be updated. And there'll be a whole series of recommendations around Social Security, SSI, EITC, and SNAP. And the kind of issues we dealt with is, well, if I'm applying for benefits, what's the issue about assets? How much can I have? What do I have to spend down, if anything? How can my assets, which kinds of assets should be counted? Or in the question of SNAP, if my kids are receiving free and reduced lunches at school, well, what happens to my SNAP benefits during vacations? And then clearly a very large overreaching issue of how do we ensure that there's eligibility for documented immigrants. And then on the new program side, those are updating programs that are currently in existence. You'll see we talked about universal income base, which is a sort of a different reframed version of universal basic income, a negative income tax to try to provide an income floor, things that have been talked a lot about recently about creating a national paid family leave and medical leave program, and the whole issue of how do we deal with long-term care and the payment of long-term care. Is it insurance? Is it social assistance? Is it some other kinds of tax program to meet those needs? So this is a huge set of recommendations, a very thorough look at a whole range of issues that I think people are familiar with, and I think it provides an incredibly significant roadmap, for us to all begin to discuss, dig in, and take forward. And with that, I might turn this over to Renee.
Actually, I'm going to take the next shot, Andy,
Okay.
and then I'll turn it to Renee. But thank you, Alix and Andy. I especially, Andy, want to acknowledge your role as a pioneer in economic security policy, and to have you characterize this report the way you did means an awful lot to us. I just want to make one slight clarification to one word you used, Andy, and that was the word recommendations. In true Academy style, our reports provide options. We neither recommend for or against any of them. We want others to have the opportunity to look at how we've assessed them and make those decisions on which to advocate for or to oppose. So just wanted to make that clarification. Let's look at the next pillar, protection policy. What is protection policy? It consists of policies that protect against fluctuations in income and expenses by promoting savings, by reducing debt, by accessing credit, and by regulating key financial actors, including banks, other lenders, landlords, and state and local governments. Now, there are two main mechanisms that protection policy employs. The first is the promotion of individual savings to serve as something of a shield against financial shocks. And that's the recognition that all government programs and programs of employers may not add up to enough, that there is a role for individual savings where that is feasible. It also has a mechanism that we call limiting potential threats to a person's income, such as high and burdensome interest payments on debt. Obviously, we're all hearing a constant discussion about student loan debt and the crushing impact it is having on younger workers. Now, protection policy functions by helping households build savings to draw upon when their income is low, and by preventing losses or reductions of income that harm a household's economic security. Within promoting savings, the report offers options to do things like increase retirement savings, including auto enrollment into a retirement plan for all workers and expansion of the saver's credit. The promoting savings section includes options to increase savings for pre-retirement needs, including a baby bonds program or allowing the United States Postal Service to provide non-bank financial services. On the other side, options to prevent capture include means to limit predatory lending, to limit the financial burden of student loans, as I already referred to, options to reduce the harm of fines and fees imposed by the legal system, and better access to legal services for lower income households. So these are all within this category that is another one of the pillars. And now we have a fourth, but by no means final pillar, and that is the equity pillar. I'm going to turn it back over to Renée Landers to cover the equity pillar. Renée?
Thank you, Bill. And thank you, Alix and Andy, also for those really good descriptions of what those sections of the report are about. Before I talk about the equity policy, we would be remiss if we did not express our appreciation to the staff of the Academy, who without their help, their guidance, their perseverance, and their patience with the members of the study panel, this report would not ever have made it over the finish line. So I want to give a shout out to all of them, because I think we can't go through this process without really thanking them in a very, very big way for helping us produce this report. So the fourth and final pillar identified in our report is the equity pillar. And equity policies are designed to address the severe inequities among different demographic groups. And at the core of addressing inequities among demographic groups is ensuring access to the opportunities that are critical to building economic security. And most importantly, equity is a pillar in and of itself, but many of the key equity issues embedded in each of the other, but many equity issues are embedded in each of the three other pillars. So you will see quite a bit of overlap here. So under the equity pillar, the report highlights the many barriers that individuals with criminal records face, and notes and observes that today Black people are incarcerated at about 5 times the rate of white people. We also look at options to address the racial wealth gap, including improving access to opportunities associated with wealth building, such as home buying and graduating from college. And then, as mentioned, certain options in other pillars have equity implications. Reforming wages for incarcerated persons, for example, might help those individuals save or invest in themselves for when they return to active participation in society. Eliminating asset tests might allow many more low-income households to gain access to income supports that would improve their lives significantly on a daily basis. And fairness in federal the federal fairness in lending law would ensure that, for example, a poorly timed payday loan won't financially debilitate a household for years to come. And then we could go on and talk about the other ideas that have been mentioned about enforcing some of the laws or using them more effectively that are designed to prohibit against discrimination in the labor markets, in housing, to protect workplace safety, to provide equity in K through 12 education so that all people get off to a good start. And it's already been mentioned, some of the challenges faced by persons with disabilities. So among the policy options that the report discusses are removing some of the barriers to opportunity for people with criminal records, addressing the racial wealth gap, exploring and creating a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. And then under equity and labor benefit and protection, improving or eliminating sub-minimum wages, improving under benefits, improving eligibility design for means-tested spending programs, and under protection, regulating certain private debt practices. I did notice that there was a question in the chat about whether we were going to discuss Medicare. And to respond to that question, I would say I would refer everyone to the report issued, I want to say at the beginning of 2020, in March of 2020, the Academy released a report of another study panel that explored in some detail the options or possibilities of using Medicare as a platform for expanding access to healthcare insurance generally. And in the context of that report, there was a detailed discussion about, some of the value of the Medicare program, but also in ways in which it could be improved. So I think that I would leave that comment there. And then say that now that we've given you a brief overview of all of these pillars, I'm going to pass it back to Bill. I already, took a part of his role in answering that one question, but leave it to Bill to moderate a more robust Q&A.
Thank you, Renee. We want to encourage all of you now to take advantage of the Q&A function on Zoom and begin to submit your questions. I want to also, in elaboration on Renee's last point, looking backward to the 2020 report we did on Medicare is one resource we encourage you to take a look at. But I want to give you a little tip of something to come. We currently have a COVID-19 task force that has a policy translation working group that will be issuing its own suite of policy options, answering the question, what did we learn from this pandemic as to how programs responded? Where did they respond effectively? Where did they not? And what have we learned going forward? And that task force will have two sections, income security and health security. So we are not overlooking the critical role health plays in overall economic security. Just wanted to give you a heads up to stay tuned for that report. So let's see if we have questions in the queue. Let me go on the Q&A. Okay, we have quite a few. Let me start with, you mentioned disincentives to work. This moral hazard argument is common, but no evidence of this has ever been shown. And even recent research has shown that the substantial expansion of unemployment insurance benefits did not reduce the labor supply. What support, if any, did the panel find for a work disincentive concern? Who'd like to take a shot at addressing that question?
Well, I could start by saying that the report actually does try to address some of the common critiques of, providing additional assistance to people. And I would say that the report does not necessarily assume that providing additional resources to people will address disincentives to work. And the report, I do believe, takes note of some of the recent pilot projects providing cash payments to families, with no strings attached, low-income families, Stockton, California, Chelsea, Massachusetts, Cambridge, Massachusetts. And all of those programs, and there are others, all of those programs have been the subject of extensive monitoring and study. And I would say that the question is correct, because they have not demonstrated that those programs have created any disincentive to work.
Thank you, Renee. Alix, Andy, anything you want to add to that?
I can chime in quickly and say that I think as the question lays out really nicely, that we got a really nice experiment during the CARES Act enhancements to UI, and the Dubé study and several others show that we didn't see decreases in work effort. And we also saw similar studies around the enhanced child tax credit during the pandemic. So I think this is really interesting and exciting, and that the evidence is really building, showing that income supports actually can facilitate people working rather than pulling them away from the labor market. And so I think for that reason, I'm really excited about some of the ideas that the report explores related to unemployment insurance. So there are ideas about how to provide supports and training to workers, but there's also just a lot in there about how we can actually bring unemployment insurance to meet the needs for income replacement for workers today, whether that's addressing financing or thinking about independent contractors or thinking about federal standards. I think all of those super pressing evidence-based issues with the unemployment insurance system are really what the report focuses on.
And Alix,
I just pick up on the very last part of what Alix said on the issue of independent contractors, and the issue of who is an employee and therefore participating in some of these social insurance programs. The state Supreme Court in Massachusetts yesterday just rejected the proposed ballot question that would have put to the voters in the referendum this question, sort of modifying the definition of employee under state law, and still classifying rideshare drivers as independent contractors, but giving them access to some additional labor protections. So I thought that's a very interesting thing, and that's going to mean that that the state can continue to enforce the definition of employee under state law.
Thank you, Renee. That's a very timely comment as well. I'm going to sound like a broken record when someone refers to an issue that we are addressing in another way. We have another task force, a task force on unemployment insurance, that will be doing a deep dive into the clear shortcomings of that. I hate to call it a system, because it really is a patchwork of state programs, and we'll be taking an in-depth look at what that system needs to do in order for it to provide the goals of the 1935 Social Security Act that created the unemployment insurance program. So stay tuned for that as well. Next question: what can be done for the unprecedented inequality of incomes and access to public resources for economic minorities? That's a theme that runs throughout the report. Anybody want to focus on some particular options to address inequality?
Well, I mean, I'll start. I mean, I already said some things when I addressed some of the equity options that the report identifies, but I do think that, we have, a lot of inequalities in a lot of systems, starting with the K through 12 educational system, the disproportionate effect of the criminal justice system on Black and Brown people and their families, the problems that immigrants, and especially undocumented immigrants, have in the society. I mean, they're here, sort of pretending that they're not here and part of the economy is just not, doesn't seem to be like a sensible option. The problem of sub-minimum wages. Is the minimum wage adequate for someone who works? And then, this issue of, enforcing the employment discrimination and the labor laws that we do have already much more effectively so that they actually, serve the interests of the workers. I'll start there. I'm sure other people have other things they would say about what's identified in the report.
So this is Andy. I would just say two things. One is, I think there's a lot of things in this report to provide, additional income to people. And although it's only kind of offhandedly referred to, the truth is in unionized workplaces, the discrepancy in income, is far different than in non-union workplaces. But that's only within a firm. I think the asset question is much more complicated. I think we have a lot here that would make a real difference for people who are facing discrimination. Renée named some, and I had a whole group of other expansions, that would, I think, again, help. But I think the asset question is a more complicated question that's not as directly addressed here, and yet it is just a disgrace, differentiation of assets and the discrimination in the housing market historically, that I think, could use more attention, but there was only so much could be done in this panel.
I'll just add, I thought one thing that was really one of the most exciting discussions we had as a group, and that is something that's actually directly targeted at addressing racial inequities directly, was to evaluate proposals for reparations. So I think that's something that, prior to working on this panel, which had such a range of kind of political orientations, I thought this was an idea that might not be something that we came to consensus on easily, but I was really surprised and excited to see our robust discussion of reparations and to see that included in the report as an important strategy for addressing the racial wealth gap.
Okay, we're getting more questions, many of which I would label provocative. Here's one. Does the report examine reforms and proposals using an administrative burden lens? It seems like many of the proposals could help to reduce that, but I'm curious if that was explicitly analyzed throughout the process.
Well, I think that the options that are discussed about, kind of rethinking, asset tests, simplifying application processes for benefit programs like SNAP and, TANF and all of that are really aimed at reducing that administrative burden. It's very, common to think, our whole society, I've, written about this, is that our whole society is based on this idea that you can't help the stranger who might be unworthy of society's beneficence. And therefore we should structure these programs to keep out the people who might take advantage of that situation. And as we've been discussing throughout this webinar, that isn't necessarily a correct assumption about what happens with these programs. And second, it discounts the fact that doing things like means testing and having all kinds of, complicated applications processes have their costs for the administration of the program, not just for the people that the programs are designed to benefit. And so at some point, you kind of reach a point where it's not really effective to have all those kinds of screens that can be expensive to administer. And if you think about the Medicare program, since somebody already raised the Medicare program, that everybody is eligible, right? On the payment side, it's a whole different complicated mess. But on the eligibility side, everyone is eligible, and Medicare has some of the lowest administrative costs of any health insurance program in the country.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I mean, Bill correctly reminded me these are recommendations, not recommendations, they're options. But I would say in a lot of the discussion, the question you're raising, Jim, was there on, well, a universal basic income doesn't really have a lot of administration requirements. And every time we try to tinker with other programs, we got to deal with asset decisions and cliffs and, eligibility and redefining eligibility. And so I think, within this, even though we may not have used a clear lens, I think as people decide which of these options, seem to make more sense, I think that is an important consideration, because some of them, as we saw, during the stimulus are just very simple, or like Medicare or UBI are very simple, and other ones, no matter how well-intentioned you are, it's just incredibly complex to write the rules.
Okay, here's another question that is focused on the protection segment, and that's please address the dysfunction of 401ks as a savings instrument. Most people, including me, don't know how to invest profitably and safely, and the tax benefit is not significant for those who don't owe income tax. We addressed retirement savings as a very legitimate part of the economic security puzzle, but there is this ongoing debate. If you have to sacrifice $1 of tax revenue, is it better to sacrifice it through promoting 401k savings or other individual retirement arrangements, or is that dollar better spent expanding Social Security? That's an ongoing debate, and I think the question gets to that question: who benefits most from 401k plans in comparison to the old defined benefit pensions, and of course the largest defined benefit pension of all, which is Social Security. So yeah, that's clearly an underlying concern. This is a very broad question, but again, I'd put it as a provocative one. Should individuals have the option to start a business instead of working as an employee? Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, I think that one of in the discussion, and maybe, in the discussions we had about, some kind of, basic income payment to people, we pointed out that people have a lot of different goals. They may have a lot of different goals. And if you structure the program too narrowly, we'll only pay for food, we'll only pay for housing, whatever it is, you're leaving a lot of initiative and opportunity for people, unaddressed. They can't take advantage of it. And so the beauty of these kinds of cash payments is that people could use them to invest in a business, or invest, to spend some time out of work, but pursuing higher education or some other educational opportunity, or taking care of, an ill relative or something like that. So it's, I think that the focus of the report is on trying to give people flexibility, so that they can choose, how to actualize their goals.
All right, we have another question that goes to the introduction of this webinar, when we said one of the issues that stimulated the study panel was the focus on what was called universal basic income. We thought that concept had been batted around and gotten, fairly or not, some baggage. So we thought a short income was a different way to phrase it. But the question being asked by one of our attendees is, if UBI were to be implemented nationally, what would be the impact on other programs that are already in place? And if I could take the liberty, Andy, of asking you to start on this one.
Yeah, I mean, that's just clearly a choice, of what you want to do. There are people, who look at ideas like food stamps and say, would we better to cash them out, and make them part of a universal basic income? And then all of it begs the question of what level is the universal basic income? If you had a $40,000 per person year universal basic income, people cash out a lot of things. because the burden of all the bureaucracy and eligibility and what you can spend your money on in SNAP, is just so complicated. A lot of people just say, give me the money. So, I think as what we're trying to do here, we're trying to build a portfolio of benefits that give you economic security in an assured fashion, and so, I think these are just policy choices. And, I appreciate everybody has a favorite policy for a favorite community that they want to serve. But I think as we learn with Social Security, things that are universal, things that don't cost a lot to administer, things that the government doesn't torture people, who are seeking assistance, work a lot better. But, clearly there's certain things like housing that aren't as easily addressed in a universal basic income policy. So I think it's a series of choices, and a lot of people will just draw the line in different places, of which ones should stay and which ones should go. It's very easy, and the politically correct thing to say is, oh, we'll just build it on top of the current program. I happen to think of programs that are currently badly built don't need to have things built upon it if the money can be used in a better way for people.
Okay, we have time for one last question, and it's one of those overarching questions, which I think is a good way to end this segment. Did the panel look at economic security from the standpoint of the social contract, which recognizes that the relationship between the individual, household, and society at large is inherently reciprocal with mutual obligations and responsibilities? Would like to tackle that overarching question.
Well, I think I kind of alluded to it. And one of the things I said earlier about this idea that, these programs, the history of the country is that the programs have always been trying to figure out who was deserving of help and who was not deserving of help. I won't give you my speech about colonial poor laws, but that's where it all started. And so, a lot of the structure of these programs continues to reflect that effort to screen out the undeserving beneficiary. But the problem, even with the programs that were designed with some sort of larger social contract in mind, was that those programs always excluded certain disfavored segments of the population. The GI Bill, rampant discrimination against Black veterans, right? Which is one of the things that has contributed to, the housing problems and the failure of communities of color to build assets. The Social Security program, and we can, debate to the end of time whether it was deliberate or not, or discriminatory in its intent, but excluding huge classes of workers who are predominantly people of color. Household employees, agricultural workers. And, I know that adjustments have been made since the onset of the program, so that even in that sort of, those halcyon days of the, those programs, the vitality of unions, although that seems to be coming back, and all of that sort of thing. There were people who were excluded. And our report is really trying to stop that, to make the programs benefit everyone.
Well, I think that sums it up perfectly. Let me thank you, Andy and Alix, again for being part of this very stimulating discussion. I hope this is enticing many of you to dig into the report in depth. I hope you'll find that we did not sugarcoat it. We acknowledged shortfalls and put them in perspective in a way that we hope will lead to action on the part of policymakers. So, Renee, Andy, and Alix, thank you again. We're now going to turn to the final segment of today's program, and that is the Stakeholder Panel. As Jason Fichtner mentioned in his opening remarks, a critical aspect of building this report was our deliberate engagement with stakeholder voices. To do this, we invited leaders of stakeholder organizations, 3 of whom are joining us today, to participate in virtual seminars in which our principal investigator, Kathryn Edwards, presented an outline of the report and offered opportunities for participants to weigh in on gaps in our understanding of certain issues and priorities for their communities which they view from a frontline perspective. So hearing from representatives of those most affected by income security policies really helped the study panel ensure that our final suite of policy options actually reflected the real needs of households across the country. And as a result of this innovation in the Academy's policy work, we are making stakeholder engagement a priority of our Pathways to Economic Security campaign and all of our projects moving forward. So with that, we're very fortunate to be joined for the final segment of our webinar by three representatives of the stakeholder groups. Joshua Arce, the President and CEO of Partnership with Native Americans. Suzanne Adely, the co-director of the Food Chain Workers Alliance. And Kathryn Monet, the CEO of the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. So we'll ask each of you to speak about the community that your organization serves, your organization's purpose, your role, and any other perspectives you want to offer on the work of our study panel. So Joshua, can I ask you to kick it off, then turn it to Suzanne, and Suzanne then turn it to Kathryn. Joshua?
Bonjour, greetings. Thank you for having me today, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important work that's being done. Again, my name is Joshua Arce. I'm a member of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation of Kansas. I'm currently the president and CEO for Partnership with Native Americans. We're a Native-led, Native-serving nonprofit that is based out of Dallas, but the primary bulk of our work is done in the Northern Plains out of a Rapid City office, and then out of Phoenix for the Southwest office. Our work includes immediate solutions, immediate services, and long-term solutions. We service primarily reservation, remote, rural, geographically challenged, and isolated communities, all Native American. So we service the tribes in those areas, and our nonprofit has been in work for 30 years. And we do everything from servicing day-to-day needs to leadership development. I appreciate the opportunity to participate today, and I think that this work is critical in looking at how it impacts the Native American communities that we serve, and in a lot of ways, the communities that I've been to and I've come from. I have relatives that. When we look at this on a grand scale, the life expectancy for Native Americans is 73 years of age, which is typically 5 years lower than a national average. And so when we're talking about these programs kicking in at 67 or 65, you see that window of being able to leverage those benefits is pretty small. And there's not a whole lot of opportunity to take advantage of the work that may have been put in for 35 years. 25% or up to 1 in 3 in Native Americans live in poverty. And so this challenge that we have goes across the board and touches on really all 4 of those pillars, in addition to the fact that only up to 15% have college degrees. And these challenges go into those areas very deep in all levels. And I noticed even with some of the questions that they were asked about Black or brown communities. And this is a problem for Native communities because of visibility, and erasure is real. And so we are constantly trying to fight for those levels of equity to make sure that we can continue to survive. At this stage in the game, the most important thing that we've seen post-pandemic is really survival. When we have communities that are being wiped out with language speakers, we're losing huge parts of our culture. And those are the types of things that can't be replaced. If we go from one community that has 7 fluent speakers to only 2 fluent speakers, those are losses that will be more than difficult to be replaced. These issues are pretty consistent throughout Indian country. All areas of the pillars touch Indian country and touch the communities that we serve. So again, I'll pass it off to the next person, but I do thank you for that opportunity to be here and to participate in this initiative.
Thank you, Joshua. Suzanne, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. And please do let me know if I'm talking too long. So I'm the co-director of the Food Chain Workers Alliance, which is an alliance of 34 worker-based organizations in the food economy in the US, but also in Canada, where we have 2 members. And our membership consists of mainly worker centers, but also a handful of unions, national and local unions, and a couple of advocacy-based organizations. And our membership sort of is either led by or has a base of or advocates for workers who span the food economy. So that includes farm workers, food processing workers, logistics, food logistics like warehousing and distribution, food service, including restaurants and street vendors, any labor that you can think of that are part of the food supply chain. And food workers actually constitute the largest workforce in the United States. It's larger than the healthcare industry. And food workers also are not only the largest workforce, but they have the lowest median wage of any workforce. And they have the highest rates of dependency on public aid benefits like SNAP. So they have the highest or one of the highest rates of food insecurity among their populations. So essentially not being able to afford the very food that they grow and produce and serve. Sort of for the labor in the food system, much of it is also very much invisible. But if you look at it, you'll see that there are also kind of very high rates of chronic sicknesses, mental stress that are a result of conditions on the job, also high rates of injuries and deaths, very often kind of unseen due to conditions on the job. And also high rates of gendered and racialized discrimination and abuse, depending on the sectors that we're talking about. And, you know, one of the, just as kind of help you visualize this a little bit, the food service industry is actually the largest sort of within this supply chain. And, you know, and even though a lot of what happens in the food service industry, restaurants, cafeterias seem visible to us, there's also a lot that takes place in these workplaces that are invisible to us. And food workers also are subjected to sort of like very high rates of wage theft, as well as the denial of the right to organize themselves, right, into unions. And sometimes that right is denied by the law itself. And sometimes that right is denied just because of practices of retaliation and fear and other sorts of circumstances that prevent them from being able to organize. And you know, one huge sort of circumstance that leads to that kind of preventing workers from being able to organize is that many of these workers are precarious, right? In that, you know, what we're seeing in many of these industries are temporary jobs. They're not permanent jobs, right? And in situations like that, you know, there's the amount of job security is quite low, right? And you know, our population includes communities that are identified as Latino, as Black, as Indigenous, and also as poor and working class whites, depending on the sectors that we're talking about. And also, migrants, refugees, and immigrants, and particularly like in sectors like we have two street vending organizations, like really from all over the world, not just from Latin America. And circumstances like also kind of being out of status is also another obstacle to being able to organize. Now, the Alliance has come together to act as a united voice of these working class populations throughout the supply chain in order to advocate for the visibility of the labor in the food supply chain and the circumstances that I have just described, and to work together to push the types of policies that are needed to protect workers, very much like some of the policies that you've mentioned in this report, but also to work together towards supporting each other's local fights. It's not just about federal policy. And a lot of what we do as the Food Chain Workers Alliance is really focus on building the infrastructure so that our member-based organizations can organize locally to pass local policy, to have a voice in federal policy, but also to organize in their workplaces. And I think that, so a lot of what what that looks like is, things like directing funds towards our members, trainings, on the ground support, and some of that is very much kind of directed towards supporting, campaigns to unionize, right? And some as well as policy campaigns, and or not just to unionize, but to sort of like have the opportunity to be an organized force, because I think, so our policy focuses really are around like the conditions of work that I described, like health and safety. It's around status and equal protection for our workers who are migrants, but also around racial equality. And it's also sort of really fundamentally around this idea of the right to organize, right? And not just kind of in the legal framework, but kind of challenging all of those circumstances that are an obstacle for people to organize, right? Because I think that if you hear from workers and working class communities themselves, they will tell you that the biggest protection for them in regards to their incomes, as well as to their own like health and safety and sanity, is being organized, or being unionized. That's the biggest protection that they could have. And I'll just end by saying that, like, just on a personal note, I mean, my father was a factory worker, right? And my father's income never passed a particular threshold, but my father was in a union. And what that equaled was economic security for us and kind of being able to plan our economic lives in a particular way. And those are the kind of jobs that our base are trying to build.
Suzanne, thank you. We'll be coming back to some of the issues you've articulated so profoundly. Kathryn, your perspective.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kathryn Monet, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. NCHV was founded back in 1990 at a time when veterans were 1 in 4 of the people experiencing homelessness. We're now in a much better place in terms of that number, but we do a lot of our really great work with partners across the country who are oftentimes, organizations that are providing crisis response services to veterans, organizations that are developing affordable housing, permanent supportive housing, and organizations that are providing other supports and services to veterans. When you think about homelessness, it's really a mismatch between the available affordable housing in a community and what an individual can actually afford to rent. So when you translate that into our priorities as it relates to this report, we really, as an organization, think a lot about housing affordability. We think a lot about bolstering the system of crisis response and services and supports for veterans. We also think a lot about employment services and the role that an income can actually play in someone's ability to afford their housing. And then in looking at some of the inequities in terms of who actually experiences homelessness and their experience as they move through the crisis response system, because I'm sure it's no secret to anybody, but the most likely veterans to experience homelessness are veterans who are Black, who are Native American, who are Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian, veterans who are transgender, and people who are generally marginalized or minoritized. So I think those are our top 3 priorities, and I'm going to pause there to give folks an opportunity for Q&A.
All right, well, thank you. I'd like to just start off by having each of you just more specifically address the largest challenges that your community is facing at the moment, particularly when it comes to income security. We have about 100 policy options in our report. Did any jump out at you and say, look, this would be at the top of my policy priority list because it would make the biggest difference to members of my community? Joshua, could I start with you on that?
Sure. So I think one of the things, looking at it from the long game for the communities that we serve, is the education component. Access to education, equity in education, because that really sets the framework up for earning potential and the opportunity to build wealth. And so that what we're seeing in our communities now is actually a 20% decrease in college applicants, those first-year college applicants. So that's a huge number of individuals that are not taking that first step into college. And we still have a large volume of first generation college students. And so to me, any of the incentives that can go towards a educational component, the vocational initiatives that are taking place, expanding what's an option or underneath the umbrella for that will help to build, the labor market. It will benefit the community. It provide that long game approach. And so that's been one of the biggest concerns that we've had so far, is the huge dip in college applicants for our communities.
Thank you, Joshua. Suzanne, Kathryn, you want to weigh in on priorities from your perspective?
I think some of the things that were mentioned before is removing the sub-minimum wage is really important, raising the minimum wage, and expanding UI benefits, particularly to workers who are out of status.
Kathryn?
So from my perspective, I think I really appreciated some of the proposals around individuals who are aging, because one of the things that is, I don't want to say a dirty secret, but a thing that's becoming more apparent about the population that's experiencing homelessness is that they're aging at a really quick rate. And homelessness is something that, ages you at an average of 10 years older, right? So they say that when you're a homeless person, your health conditions that you face are, I guess, accelerated by 10 years. So a homeless 50-year-old might come in the condition of a 60-year-old. And so that really affects your ability to go out and earn a good wage or continue at whatever type of employment you may have been doing earlier. And so I do think some of the proposals or options, I can't stick to what we're calling it. There was a word that you used and it was very specific.
Options.
But some of the options around aging adults, I think, were really resonant for my community.
Great. One of the reasons we are systematically engaging stakeholders in the Academy's work is because very often we as policy wonks come at this from such an academic perspective, and it implies not a clear understanding of the target groups that you represent. If you were to say, I'd like to give you examples of misconceptions you have about our groups. Are there particular misconceptions that you want to put on the table for all of us to be able to be more sensitive about and understand?
I can dive in if nobody else has
please,
any. Yeah, I think, when you think about people who are homeless in general, right, there's this huge stigma about, oh, they must be using drugs, oh, they must be this, oh, they must be that. And oftentimes that's not the case, right? Oftentimes you hear in different communities that people assume that the people experiencing homelessness are from some other far, far away place where things are very terrible, and they're just coming here to use our services and use our benefits. And that's rarely ever the case either. Statistics have borne out that lots of people who experience homelessness are doing so in communities where they are from because they have ties to that. And many people who are experiencing homelessness don't use substances. They've just sort of fallen on hard times. And so I do think the one thing that I want to push back on is, this idea that homeless people aren't like us, because oftentimes they are much more like us than we care to believe.
Thank you. Joshua, Suzanne?
I would push back on the myth that Native Americans don't pay taxes. I think that's one of the most damaging tropes that are out there that has continued throughout history and is far from accurate. I'm Native American. I've always had to pay my taxes since I've been able to file. I know with our community, we were fortunate enough to have a casino, and all of those employees pay federal taxes and they've paid state taxes. And so this ideology that Native Americans don't pay taxes, in some ways, is one of the most damaging, tropes that are out there, because in a lot of ways, the Native communities that are able to, and individuals are paying into these programs, and they should have the same rights to access them when they need them, or to help further themselves to bettering their lives or their children's lives.
Okay, Suzanne.
Yeah, on a similar note, I think that's also a myth about migrant working communities and who also pay taxes. And I think one of the biggest is this idea that their labor is unskilled labor, which is a way of devaluing what they contribute to our society and our food system.
Yeah, the terminology that is pervasive in the policy world sometimes is viewed by those of you representing communities as, how dare you, right? I had one brought to my attention. This is a word I used in a well-intentioned way, and that would be that we're trying to help vulnerable populations. And I'll never forget, one woman said to me, Bill, for 2 years of my life, I lived in a car with my mother, and I'm now a practicing attorney. How dare you call me vulnerable, right? I'm resilient. And I realize even well-meaning words like that, and they are well-intended, but we know how they sound when we say them, but we don't know how they're heard by the people we're describing. And even words like that, we just have to be so sensitive to how those are not accurate characterizations of populations in groups that we're focused on. Let me ask each of you, much of the report looks at individual economic security, household economic security. But if there were to be a level of assured income that no household were to fall below, what would that mean to the economics of the communities that you serve? In other words, what is the kind of the macro impact beyond the individuals and the households that are the recipients of assured income? Anybody want to weigh in on that?
I'd be happy to start. I think that that would be huge, not just for the individuals from that community, but for the surrounding community. And so if I'm representing and I'm talking about specific reservation communities, those reservation communities don't have a Walmart nearby. Those are in border towns. So if this income is going to individuals, they still have to spend it someplace else. They're not going to be able to keep that money completely in a community. Now, it could also have some opportunity for economic development, because if there are some businesses that then follow the money, then the tribal money can stay in tribal communities, and then it can build on itself. But otherwise, that money is going to go to schools, it's going to go to businesses, and it'll go to other areas. If individuals are able to finally purchase cars or they're buying homes, those state, county taxes that'll be paid, that's where that money will go. It will thereby have a direct impact on the broader context of that whole community. It doesn't stay in one place. It's not something that's going to stay in one household. It will get dispersed out through any location where it is. And that we're talking about the rural and remote communities that we serve.
Thank you. Suzanne, Kathryn, bigger effects, not that it's not enough to be affecting the individual and household security, but community economic security. What do you think?
I think that if you ask different members of our base, they might have different answers, but I'll try to think about what I think people might say, right? And I think that certainly if there was a sort of like a base income that was guaranteed to everybody, that could be helpful, right? But I guess then the question will then lead to this, is it just about the income, or is it about what our members refer to a lot is kind of like building an ecosystem in the regions in which they're organizing, right? So is it enough to have the income? I mean, what is the income going towards, right? It's like, the services, the a collective food system, affordable housing and healthcare. Like if the income is just going to be funneled back into a market, right, that is not regenerating their own kind of like long-term wealth and happiness, then it's just income that goes back into the market. So I think that it's just, they would say that there's more to it.
And Kathryn, from your perspective, one of the things that we realize is that income alone might not have the same value as, for example, unhoused individuals, where some guarantee of housing of some sort would be needed for income to make a real impact. Just would welcome your perspective on that question.
Well, so I think you're absolutely right when you say that. I think the population that we serve kind of starts so far behind the start line, right? That for them, income would really mean being able to afford housing and not having to make the hard choices between utilities and medical treatment, or, extra school activities for their kids, or, staying in a hotel versus sleeping in their car. Like the choices are just different. But I think having that income paired with, some solid affordable housing and some supportive services would really make a big impact and would allow people to focus on what they could do to actually thrive and do better for the next generation, as opposed to how they'll survive today and what will they eat and where will they sleep.
All right. And one other angle I want to address to you, Suzanne, when some people talk about universal basic income and having everyone have access to a predictable source of money that can help them ride through different crises in life. I've heard some refer to this idea of guaranteed income as a individual strike fund that would enable workers to withhold their labor, knowing they've got this floor below which they can't fall. Does that concept make sense?
Yeah, I think that that could make a lot of sense to some of the worker bases that we work with, right? I think there's also, there's also this aspiration that many of these communities have to sort of like no longer be, a commodity themselves, right? Or and to sort of like, because I know that this was a question that was posed in the Q&A chat box about like whether or not like, we're like people should aspire from like being part of like the wage workforce to actually kind of being a small business owner. And it's a little bit different, right? It's like, to like, they can continue to sort of work in food production and food processing with better jobs and better income and be able to sort of like have more power on the job as well, right? But I think in addition to that, they also kind of want to, build something that is, that means that changes the power dynamic of them always kind of like being in this worker-employer relationship. And sometimes that might mean having co-ownership over the food production and the food processing that they do, but also collectively, not necessarily for the purpose of becoming, of recycling this kind of like kind of market economy that they see exploiting them.
All right. And then Joshua, we have one last question coming in. I think you were starting to type an answer, but if there's a way you can just say a few words about it, and that is the status of the tribal TANF benefits. Is that something that you can say a few words about?
Sure. So I think in general, overall, it's and it was interesting. I was reading the comment. It's a little bit different from what the comment explained, but in the majority of tribal communities I've worked with, it's usually more need than funds available. The program is chronically underfunded. There's certainly nothing superior about a tribal TANF or tribally administered TANF program. And there are multiple other programs that are stacked in order to try and leverage the money for the students to be successful, whether it's a TANF program or a JOM program. There are a variety of programming available. The problem is usually access. We've talked about the administrative burden with staying current on those requirements or getting approved of them in the first place. But they also, as with most state-sponsored programs, they come with the stigma for those people that are accessing them. And so that can be something that can push candidates away. But there's definitely, again, it's chronically underfunded. You typically more need than can be administered. But nothing, it was a unique, what's going on in Ohio is unique if that is indeed the case. But there are definitely no surplus of funds that are sitting around idly by.
Well, Suzanne, Joshua, Kathryn, thank you again for giving us your precious time as part of the process of developing this report, being with us today. And I hope this is the beginning of an ongoing relationship between us as policy folks and you as practitioners, and the overlap between the two. We have a lot to learn from you. So I hope we can keep this dialogue going. So thanks for being part of it. We deeply appreciate it. And thanks to all of you who spent a late afternoon with us. We appreciate your attention and your participation. We don't want it to be a one-time event. We'd like feedback from you. So if you go on our website, look at the report. If you have questions, you want to get involved in commenting on it, please send them to Griffin Murphy, gmurphy@nasi.org. Griffin, as I said earlier, was the key policy person, although behind Griffin is a whole policy team here at the Academy that is dedicated to helping us advance solutions that can make a real difference in the lives of people and in the economic sphere of the United States. We have a multi-year Pathways to Economic Security campaign. Its theme is bringing all voices to the table. And we'll be releasing essays from both our study panel members, stakeholder organizations, and others that will dive deeper into both specific policies that are discussed in the report and into options and spaces that were not discussed in the report. This is a very dynamic process. So I ask you to please keep your eyes out for those on our website. As I said earlier, we'll also have more reports of our various task forces coming down the pike in 2022. We'll be very excited to share them all with you and hope that you get value out of each of them. In the last few days, I happened to see something posted in social media that seemed to me to address a value that you seldom hear us in our country talk about, and yet it's such a common value in other nations. And that's the value of solidarity. The notion that we are a community, none of us is an island, so to speak, and that what affects one affects all of us. And the posting I saw that I wanted to end today's session with, I thought really brought home this concept. And here's what the posting said: it shouldn't have to happen to you for it to matter to you. And maybe that's something that we should keep in mind as we look at economic insecurity, that many of us who've been privileged not to be victims of such stress can't assume that because we haven't felt it, it doesn't matter. And I hope that's something we'll all keep in mind going forward. So thank you again for your participation and your attention. I hope you all have a very safe and healthy summer. Bye-bye.